Enslaved black people were systematically stripped of human dignity and treated as property, with violence used not only for punishment but to instill constant fear and obedience. This truth sits at the heart of a system that reshaped lives, families, and generations not through isolated cruelty, but through a carefully maintained structure of control. Slavery was not only about forced labor. It was about breaking the human spirit and redefining people as objects whose pain could be ignored, justified, or even normalized. Imagine living in a world where every movement was watched. Every mistake, real or imagined, could carry consequences, and silence itself was enforced. Fear became a daily companion, woven into routines, workplaces, and homes. Power was asserted not only through chains or whips, but through unpredictability, the constant reminder that safety was never guaranteed. This atmosphere did not exist by accident. It was designed to discourage resistance, erase identity, and replace self-worth with submission. Yet within this darkness, there is something equally important to recognize: memory. The stories that survived passed down through narratives, testimonies, and historical records exist because those who suffered refused to be completely erased. Their experiences force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the past, not to dwell in pain, but to understand how deeply injustice can be embedded in everyday systems when it goes unchallenged. This story is not told to shock for the sake of shock. It is told to remember, to understand, and to ensure that history is not softened into something easier to digest but harder to learn from. By facing these realities honestly, we honor the humanity that was denied and reaffirm the value of dignity today. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe history should be told clearly and responsibly, take a moment to support the channel. Please like the video, subscribe, and share it with others. Your support helps keep these important conversations alive, and together, we can make sure these stories are never forgotten. Whipping, often combined with salting, pepper, turpentine, or other substances rubbed into open wounds, was widespread and inflicted on men, women, and even children, sometimes without any offense, within the system already described. This practice was not an exception or an act of uncontrolled anger. It was a calculated extension of a broader design meant to enforce submission and erase any sense of personal autonomy. Violence functioned as language, one spoken fluently by those in power and understood clearly by those forced to endure it. In this world, punishment was rarely tied to justice. A person could be struck not for defiance, but for the possibility of it. Fear was cultivated deliberately, long before resistance could even take shape. Whipping became a daily reminder that the body itself was no longer one's own, that pain could be inflicted at will, and that mercy was never guaranteed. The threat did not end when the act was over. It lingered in scars, in movement, and in memory. Healing was often interrupted on purpose, ensuring that suffering was prolonged rather than resolved. The substances applied to wounds carried a meaning beyond physical pain. They transformed punishment into spectacle and warning, ensuring that injury could not be hidden and recovery could not be quiet. Pain was made visible, persistent, and unmistakable. These acts communicated dominance not only to the individual, but to everyone who witnessed the aftermath. The message was clear. Obedience was demanded, not earned, and humanity was conditional. What makes this reality especially disturbing is how ordinary it became. Violence was woven into routine, treated as management rather than cruelty. Children learned early that innocence offered no protection, and adults understood that effort or loyalty did not guarantee safety. Even silence could be punished, and compliance did not ensure relief. In such conditions, survival often meant endurance rather than escape, learning how to exist within a system that refused to recognize personhood. This cruelty also served a psychological purpose. By inflicting pain unpredictably, the system destabilized trust between parents and children. between partners, severs hint, and even within oneself. Fear became internalized. Over time, the constant anticipation of harm could be as damaging as the harm itself, reshaping how people thought, spoke, and moved through the world. Control was maintained not only through force, but through exhaustion and uncertainty. Yet, despite everything, memory endured. Accounts of these experiences survived through testimony, storytelling, and record, refusing to allow silence to finish what violence began. These memories connect directly to the broader story already unfolding, a system built to dominate, sustained through fear, and justified by false beliefs about ownership and hierarchy. The physical wounds eventually faded for some, but the truth of what they represented did not. Understanding this chapter is not about revisiting pain for its own sake. It is about recognizing how deeply normalized harm can become when power goes unchecked, and how easily suffering can be reframed as discipline or order. By acknowledging this reality honestly, the narrative remains whole. The story does not fragment into isolated horrors, but stands as a continuous account of a system that relied on cruelty to function. Remembering this is not an act of despair. It is an act of clarity, ensuring that the past is neither softened nor forgotten. Extreme physical torture included mutilation, burning, suffocation, branding, chaining, and devices like spiked barrels, designed to permanently damage bodies and terrorize others. Within the world already described where fear was cultivated and pain was normalized, these methods represented the furthest reach of a system that sought not only obedience, but absolute dominance. Violence escalated when earlier punishments failed to silence the human will, becoming more theatrical, more enduring, and more difficult to escape, even in memory. These acts were never random. Each carried a message meant to travel beyond the individual who suffered it. Mutilation removed not just strength but identity, ensuring that the marks of control followed a person wherever they went. Burning and suffocation transformed punishment into prolonged endurance, where time itself became part of the torment. Branding turned the body into a permanent record, a living sign meant to erase individuality and replace it with ownership. Chains restricted movement, but they also reshaped posture, breath, and self-perception, reminding the enslaved that even their stillness was controlled. What bound all these methods together was intention. They were designed to last. Pain did not end when the act was finished. It remained in scars, limited motion, and constant reminders of vulnerability. For those who witnessed these punishments, the effect was immediate and lasting. Seeing another person marked or restrained sent a clear warning that resistance carried consequences far beyond the moment. Fear spread quietly, reinforced not by words, but by visible proof. The environment created by such practices was one where terror replaced trust. People learned to measure their actions carefully, not because they believed in fairness, but because uncertainty ruled daily life. Even rest could feel dangerous. Even silence could feel exposed. The presence of extreme punishment meant that no one needed to be punished constantly. The possibility alone was enough to shape behavior. Control became efficient precisely because it was so severe. Yet these acts also revealed the fragility of the system that relied on them. A structure that must constantly reaffirm its authority through extreme force does so because it fears what might happen without it. The very need for such measures showed that the human spirit, even under relentless pressure, could not be fully erased. Survival itself became a quiet form of defiance, an insistence on existing within conditions designed to destroy both body and will. This chapter of the story connects directly to what came before. Whipping broke skin. These punishments aimed to break permanence. They sought to make suffering unforgettable, not only to those who endured it, but to everyone forced to live alongside its consequences. Pain became a tool of communication, ensuring that power remained visible at all times. And still, History remembers more than the methods. It remembers the people who lived through them, whose experiences survived in narratives that refused to let silence win. These stories challenge any attempt to minimize the past or separate cruelty from the system that depended on it. They remind us that such acts were not isolated excesses, but deliberate choices made within an accepted order. To understand this reality is to see the full shape of the system at work, not only how it punished bodies, but how it sought to reshape thought, memory, and possibility. So here, by holding these truths together, the story remains unified and honest, refusing to fragment into distant horrors. It stands instead as a continuous reminder of what happens when power is protected at the expense of humanity, and why remembering remains essential. Many punishments were carried out publicly, such as burnings and executions, turning black suffering into spectacles meant to reinforce racial control and unequal justice. In a system already defined by fear and constant surveillance, public punishment served a distinct purpose. It transformed private pain into collective warning. Violence was no longer confined to hidden spaces or isolated moments. It was staged, witnessed, and remembered, ensuring that its message traveled far beyond the individual who endured it. Public punishment was about visibility. By placing suffering in open fields, town centers, or plantation grounds, those in power ensured that no one could claim ignorance. Enslaved people were forced to watch, to stand still, and to absorb the meaning behind what they saw. The act itself mattered less than the lesson it carried. Authority was displayed openly, and the boundaries of power were drawn in front of an audience. Justice, as it was presented, followed different rules depending on who stood accused and who stood in judgment. These spectacles were often framed as lawful or necessary, disguising cruelty behind the language of order. Yet the imbalance was impossible to miss. The same acts that resulted in extreme punishment for black individuals were often overlooked or lightly addressed when committed by others. This unequal application of justice reinforced a rigid hierarchy, reminding everyone present that the law itself was shaped by race and status. Public punishment did not merely enforce obedience. It taught people where they were positioned within the social order. The psychological impact of these events extended far beyond the moment. Witnesses carried the images with them into their daily lives, shaping how they spoke, worked, and interacted with one another. Fear became communal, shared silently among those who understood what was at stake. The unpredictability of when and where punishment might appear intensified its effect. A single public act could govern behavior for months or even years, reducing the need for constant enforcement. At the same time, these spectacles revealed the deep insecurity of the system that relied on them. A structure confident in its legitimacy would not need constant displays of terror to maintain control. Public punishment exposed how fragile authority truly was, dependent on intimidation rather than consent. The need to repeatedly assert dominance suggested an underlying fear of resistance, of memory, and of the possibility that people might begin to question the rules imposed upon them. This chapter connects seamlessly to the earlier realities of private punishment and extreme physical control. What had been done behind closed doors was now brought into the open, not to invite reflection, but to silence it. Public suffering amplified the same message delivered through whips, chains, and scars, that black lives were subject to a different standard, one where dignity could be suspended at will. Yet even within these displays, something endured that could not be fully controlled. Memory survived. Stories were passed down, recorded, and eventually shared beyond the boundaries they were meant to reinforce. What was intended as a demonstration of power became, over time, evidence of injustice. The very visibility meant to intimidate later served as proof that unequal justice was not accidental, but deliberate. Understanding public punishment requires seeing it not as isolated cruelty, but as part of a coordinated system designed to shape behavior through fear and spectacle. It reveals how violence was woven into social life and how justice was distorted to protect power rather than people. By holding this truth alongside the experiences already described, the story remains unified and clear, showing how control operated not only through force, but through performance. Remembering this allows the past to be confronted honestly, without distortion, and ensures that the lessons carried by those public moments are neither ignored nor erased. Psychological and social punishments, including forced sale, demotion to harsher labor, and family separation, frequently resulted in lifelong trauma or death. After physical violence had established fear and public spectacle had reinforced control, these quieter punishments completed the system by attacking what remained of stability, identity, and hope. They did not always leave visible scars, yet their impact often proved just as devastating, reaching far beyond the individual and into the fabric of entire families and communities. Forced sale was among the most feared outcomes, not because of immediate violence, but because of its finality. A person could be removed without warning, transferred to an unfamiliar place, and stripped of every relationship that had given life meaning. Parents were separated from children, partners from one another, siblings scattered across regions with little chance of reunion. The uncertainty alone was a form of control, reminding everyone that no bond was secure and that attachment itself carried risk. Love became something to guard quietly, knowing it could be taken at any moment. Demotion to harsher labor functioned in a similar way. Those who had developed skills or worked in less physically demanding roles understood that a change in assignment could erase years of experience overnight. Field labor often meant longer hours, greater exposure to danger, and closer supervision, all designed to wear the body down more quickly. The threat of demotion discouraged initiative and reinforced silence, teaching people that improvement did not guarantee safety. Advancement could be reversed instantly, not as correction, but as warning. Family separation extended punishment across generations. Children grew up without parents. Parents lived with unanswered questions, and entire family lines were reshaped by absence. The emotional toll did not end with separation itself. It continued in the form of grief without closure and connections severed before they could fully form. This disruption weakened communal support, making individuals more vulnerable and easier to control. Isolation became both consequence and strategy. These punishments also carried a psychological weight that lingered long after the moment had passed. The constant awareness that one's life could be altered without explanation fostered anxiety and restraint. People learned to suppress emotion, limit attachment, and move carefully through relationships. Survival often required emotional withdrawal, a protective response to an environment where loss was routine and grief had no space to be expressed. This layer of punishment fits seamlessly into the broader system already described. Physical force established dominance, public punishment reinforced hierarchy, and psychological control ensured continuity. Together, they formed a structure that did not rely solely on visible cruelty, but thrived on anticipation and fear of loss. Control became internalized, shaping behavior even in the absence of direct violence. Yet, as with every other part of this story, these measures reveal the system's underlying weakness. A structure that depends on severing families and destabilizing lives does so because it cannot tolerate strong bonds or shared strength. The very need to break connections highlights their power, even fragmented. Seve's hint. Memory endured. People remembered names, places, and relationships. Seve's hint. Carrying them forward through stories and quiet remembrance. By understanding these social and psychological punishments alongside the physical ones, the narrative remains whole. It shows that harm was not limited to the body, but extended into identity, belonging, and future possibility. This recognition does not sensationalize suffering. It clarifies it. It reminds us that the damage inflicted was not accidental or temporary, but deliberate and lasting, and that acknowledging this truth is essential to understanding the full weight of the past. Enslaved people were also subjected to sexual violence and forced reproduction, especially after the 1808 slave trade ban, revealing how slavery commodified black bodies across generations. This final truth brings the entire story into focus, because it exposes slavery not only as a system of labor and punishment, but as one that claimed ownership over the most intimate aspects of human life. Bodies were reduced to assets, relationships were stripped of consent, and future generations were calculated as profit rather than people. After the external slave trade was outlawed, the system did not soften, it adapted. Human beings already in bondage became the means of sustaining slavery itself. Reproduction was no longer private or personal. It was monitored, encouraged, or coerced to meet economic demand. Women were valued not only for their labor, but for their ability to bear children who would inherit the same condition of bondage. Men were often denied agency as well, forced into pairings that served the interests of others rather than their own lives. In this way, slavery reached forward in time, securing its future through control of birth itself. The harm extended far beyond the physical. Consent, family, and choice were all distorted by an imbalance of power so extreme that refusal was impossible. The consequences were lifelong, shaping identities and relationships in ways that cannot be measured by records alone. Children born under these conditions entered the world already bound to a system that had planned their existence before they took their first breath. This reality reveals slavery at its most revealing level, not simply as cruelty inflicted in moments, but as domination sustained across generations. When we step back and view the full arc of this story, from physical punishment to public spectacle, from psychological control to forced reproduction, we see a system carefully constructed to leave no part of life untouched. Pain was visible, fear was internalized, and even the future was claimed. And yet, the story does not end with domination. It ends with memory. The fact that these experiences are known, spoken, and shared means that the system failed in one crucial way: it could not erase humanity completely. Remembering these truths is not about dwelling in darkness, but about clarity. It allows us to understand how injustice operates when it is normalized, protected, and passed down. It reminds us that dignity, once denied, must be actively defended. History matters not because it is distant, but because its lessons remain urgent. Thank you for listening, and for taking the time to engage with this story. If this narrative helped you see the past more clearly or encouraged reflection, please support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. Your support helps keep these stories visible and ensures that the voices carried through history are not lost to silence.